Have you ever felt like your existence in your own home is uncomfortable? As if your every step were a burden, as if your presence were only endured out of obligation, and never out of love? As if everything you built, everything you gave, everything you were, had simply stopped mattering? I have. And I'll tell you exactly how it happened. The scene seems ordinary to an outsider. A family dinner. Everyone gathered together. Laughter, conversation, dishes being served. But that day, as I struggled to remember which story my grandson wanted to hear, I noticed something different in the air. A mood that wasn't just inattention. It was judgmental. And then, as I started to speak, he interrupted me with a mocking smile and said, "She already told you that this morning." Again, Grandma. It was as if the ground had dropped beneath me. But no one noticed. No one noticed what those words did to me. Everyone laughed. Even my daughter. And there, in the midst of my own family, I felt like a forgotten object in the room. As if they were testing me, waiting for the moment I'd stumble upon my own memories just to confirm what they already thought. That I was becoming senile, useless, outdated. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt that kind of shame that you can't scream, but that slowly tightens inside you, until you can't breathe? I wanted to get up and leave. But I stayed. I stayed because I needed to look into each of their eyes. I needed to understand where such certainty that I was leaving came from. As if my mind had already said goodbye before me. And it didn't stop there. The little teasing began. "Where did you put the salt, Grandma?" Even though I knew where it was. "Do you remember what we had for dinner last night?" Like someone setting a trap. I pretended not to notice. That it didn't hurt. That it was just a joke. But inside I died a little every time they laughed at my doubt, even when it was their own invention. It was as if they were pushing me into a place I never asked to be. The place of invalidity. The place of confusion. The place of the old woman who is no longer good for anything, only to be tolerated. And the worst part? All this coming from the one I loved most in life. The one I raised, fed, protected. The one who once looked at me with eyes of admiration and now looks at me with impatience, with haste, with contempt disguised as a joke. But what they didn't know is that my memory still holds what matters. Dates may slip, details may get muddled. But the pain, the humiliation, the forced silence. I remember that clearly. And that night, while everyone laughed at me, something inside me decided it was time to stop accepting. Because as much as they thought I didn't know what was going on anymore, I knew exactly what I needed to say. My name is Helen Rose. I'm 73 years old. And if you saw me a few years ago, you wouldn't have guessed the woman you're talking about now. I was the grandma everyone loved to visit. The one who always had warm cookies fresh from the oven, who knew each grandchild's favorite food by heart, who made a point of hanging a lock of hair from their first haircut in a jar with their name embroidered on it. I was the one who left hidden notes in lunchboxes, who was late for the doctor's appointment just so I could pick up the kids from school, who decorated the whole house at Christmas just to see their eyes light up. My daughter used to say, "Mom, you are the heart of this family." And I believed it. I believed it because everything I did was done with love, with dedication, with that silent care we carry as a mission. It wasn't for recognition. It was for a sense of purpose. Because I was certain my journey had meaning as long as I was being useful, present, available. I believed that the love we sow bears fruit. That care returns. That presence leaves a mark. For years, I lived with this mindset. That being a mother and grandmother was my most sacred role. And perhaps because of this, because I believed so strongly in this place of love, the fall hurt so much. Because you don't expect that the same home where you showered affection will become the scene of your humiliation. You don't imagine that those little faces that once nestled in your lap will grow up and look at you as if you were an obstacle, a hindrance, a reminder of what they no longer want to see. But before that, I was the woman everyone turned to when they were scared. When my daughter's marriage was on the line, it was at my house that she cried for hours. When my grandson had his first panic attack, it was my hand he held in the hospital. When there was no money for school, I was the one who sold my engagement ring without a second thought. It's these behind-the-scenes moments in life that no one tells you about. The silent decisions. The invisible sacrifices. But they shape an entire story. I don't regret anything. Because back then, I saw love in their eyes. I saw gratitude, even if it wasn't spoken. There was truth in the way they hugged me. It was as if my presence had a real impact on their daily lives. That's what kept me going. The certainty that I was needed, and more than that, that I was loved. And it may seem simple, but when you reach a certain age, being loved is one of the last things that still makes us feel alive. I've always been very active, you know? I walked every day, tended the garden, read my romance novels, and wrote in a diary no one knew existed. Because even surrounded by people, I sometimes felt alone. And by writing, I remembered who I was before I was the grandma of the house. The woman who danced in the backyard listening to old radios. The young woman who painted her own furniture and dreamed of opening a small cafe. Things that fell by the wayside, but that I never let die inside. Maybe that's why it hurt so much when I realized they were slowly erasing me. Not with harsh words, but with subtle absences. Small silences. Embarrassments disguised as playfulness. Muffled laughter. And most cruel, the role reversal. I, who was the foundation, now treated like a confused child, in need of supervision, who no longer knows what to say. As if my story, my wisdom, my voice, were being pushed into a dark corner of the house, to a place where no one listens anymore. But I remember everything. And it's precisely because I remember that I needed to speak. Because the truth, no matter how silent it seems, never dies. It just waits for the right moment to be heard. And that moment was closer than I imagined. The first few times were subtle. So subtle that I wondered if I was overreacting. You know when something seems off, but you choose to ignore it because you trust the people around you too much? It was like that. I'd leave the kitchen for a minute, and when I came back, the pots and pans weren't where I'd left them. One was in the top cabinet, the other in the back of the switched-off oven. I'd frown suspiciously, but I'd end up laughing to myself and saying, "Oh, I must be getting old." And that's what they wanted me to think. That the confusion was all in my head. That it was my fault. That the problem was me. They started asking me questions with an innocent, almost gentle tone. "Grandma, do you remember where you put the TV remote yesterday? Or, you took your medicine this morning, right?" And always with that look in their eyes, as if they were already expecting the answer to be wrong. And if I said yes, there would be an exchange of glances, a little smile at the corners of their mouths. It began to erode my confidence from the inside out. Because it wasn't just about forgetting or remembering. It was about making me doubt my own lucidity. I felt like I was undergoing a test I'd never agreed to take, but which happened all the time. One night, they searched for my granddaughter's cell phone for almost half an hour. They searched the entire living room, the bedroom, until my grandson appeared with it in his hand and said, "It was in Grandma's purse." Everyone looked at me. And I swear with all my heart, that phone was never there. But in that moment, my word no longer carried weight. The lie became the truth because they said it was. And me. I kept quiet. But not because I agreed. I kept quiet because I realized that arguing would be futile. When the world decides you're confused, any word you say becomes an argument against you. The worst part wasn't actually making a mistake. It was knowing they were creating situations to make me look wrong. It was like living inside an emotional trap, carefully set behind the scenes, where my every decision would be used as evidence against me. The hidden truth of all this is that what they wanted wasn't to take care of me. It was to control, dominate, demean. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of impatience. Maybe simply because society teaches that after a certain age, you no longer have value. You become a burden. And I could feel it in the air. In the way they stopped asking me what I thought of things. In the way they made decisions for me, even when I was there, present. As if my will had lost its validity. It was a silent transformation, but with a devastating impact. First, they disregarded me in conversations. Then, in everyday choices. Until, at some point, I stopped being consulted about my own routine. We'll take you to the doctor on such and such a day, okay? The food's already prepared. That's what we have. Everything imperative. Everything decided. Life began to happen above me, and no longer with me. It's hard to admit, but I began to doubt myself. Not my sanity, that, deep down, I knew was intact, but my strength, my usefulness, my place. It was as if the pillars that held me upright had been ripped away, little by little. And in the process, frustration became my most faithful companion. A bitter feeling that accompanied me from the moment I woke up until the moment I turned out the light. And even in my sleep, I dreamed of the same scenes. The laughter, the glances, the whispers, the planted doubt. But there was something inside me that hadn't died yet. Something that resisted. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was dignity. Or maybe it was just that instinct we develop after going through a lot in life, of knowing when someone's trying to erase who you are. And I knew. I felt it. No matter how much they tried to distort my image, I knew that the fragile version they wanted to paste onto me wasn't real. And it was in that space between what they said and what I felt that something began to stir inside. A kind of ancient courage, buried beneath layers of silence. A kind of truth that needed to be spoken, even if it hurt, even if it shocked, even if it shattered all remaining comfort. Because the worst madness isn't losing your memory. It's being forced to pretend you don't remember what they're doing to you. And at that point in the journey, I was no longer willing to pretend. The week of my birthday, something changed. For a brief moment, the house felt lighter. The smiles returned, the hugs came spontaneously, and even my daughter, who had been so cold to me lately, started calling me "Dear Mother." They baked a cake, hung balloons, gave me simple gifts, a new pair of slippers, a floral blouse, a box of chocolates. And I, foolish that I am, allowed myself to believe. I wanted to believe. The truth is, we cling to any kind gesture when we're emotionally starved. And I was. I felt my heart open that day. I dressed carefully, put on perfume, and fixed my hair in front of the mirror with trembling hands. I wanted to look good. I wanted them to look at me and see the woman behind my age. The mother. The grandmother. The woman who, even hardened inside, still got emotional with small displays of affection. And when they sang happy birthday, off-key, laughing among themselves, I closed my eyes for a second and silently prayed, let this not be just polite. Let this be real. I should have suspected. Deep down, something told me that scenario was over-rehearsed. But need is sometimes stronger than intuition. We learn to settle for crumbs when we've gone too long without bread. And that day, the crumbs arrived wrapped in gift paper. I cried. I really cried. Because for me, that represented a chance to rebuild. That maybe I'd overreacted, that the cruel pranks were just a phase. That, deep down, they still saw me. After the birthday greetings, I went to my room to put away the presents. I looked at myself in the mirror again, now with red eyes, but with a shy smile. I was touched, yes. Because even though everything had been small, he had been affectionate. He had been a gesture. And for someone who has felt invisible, being remembered with a cake is already an impact. That was more than a birthday. It was a break from the silence that had surrounded me for months. But the next day, the revelation came like a punch in the gut. I woke up early, as usual, and went to make coffee. While tidying the kitchen, I heard laughter coming from my grandson's room. It was a different kind of laughter, louder, more mocking. I went to the door, which was ajar, and clearly heard my granddaughter's voice saying, "Send that to the group." The old lady crying over half a dozen balloons. And he replied, "Yeah, look at her face, she looks like she won the lottery." My body froze. I stood there motionless, listening to my name become the butt of jokes. The video of my crying face, that moment that was sacred to me, had become content for a messaging group. Digital laughter at the expense of my real pain. The grandma getting emotional about anything seen became a meme among them. I knew because I heard. I knew because I saw. My grandson left the room and didn't see me. And there, in the hallway, on the cold floor, I saw my reflection in the china cabinet mirror. I wasn't just a hurt woman. I was someone who had been betrayed to the core. The words echoed in my head for days. I tried to forget. I tried to think it was just teenagers being silly. But it wasn't just teenagers. My daughter was in the group, too. My son-in-law was too. That night wasn't about affection. It was about spectacle. About feeding the narrative of the needy old woman, the grandmother who cries at the slightest. And suddenly, that gesture that gave me hope became the most bitter memory of that time. It's at times like these that we realize how cruel a family's mentality can be without realizing it. How much disrespect can disguise itself as a joke. How much humiliation can come wrapped in affection. And this was perhaps the greatest revelation of my journey. Affection that comes without truth is just another form of control. Just another chapter behind the scenes of a story where you are the target, not the one honored. And that's when everything began to change. Because when pain breaks through the surface and reaches the place of dignity, something inside us awakens. Something no one can control, or hide, or laugh about later. Because what came next, they never imagined I'd have the courage to do. After that day, when I discovered the video circulating, something inside me changed. It wasn't anger in the classic sense. It wasn't the kind of outburst you'd expect from someone hurt. It was something else. Quieter. Deeper. A quiet revolt that settled in my chest as if to say, enough. Because it wasn't about a video anymore. It wasn't about a birthday anymore. It was about the way my story was being treated. As if all the years I'd lived had lost value. As if the sacrifices made for love could be ignored just because I now have wrinkles on my face and speak more slowly. That's when the escalation began. Not on my side. On theirs. Apparently, the game had become fun. Grandma, who cries easily, became the household pastime. They tested me. Constantly. Sometimes disguised as affection. Sometimes straight out. Grandma, where's that blue book you gave me last year? I'd say, I think it's on your shelf. They'd smile and reply, no, Grandma, my aunt gave it to me. Remember? And they'd laugh among themselves. Or they'd ask me to tell them that story about the time the power went out and the cake sank in the oven. And I'd tell it, with my usual care, trying to be exact. In the end, they'd whisper, yesterday she said it was orange cake. Today it's carrot cake. I began to live under constant observation. Any natural forgetfulness that comes with age became another point on their scorecard. She forgot where she put her keys again. Today she stared into space for a few seconds. I think it's getting worse. They didn't say this to me. But they said it close enough for me to hear. As if I had no right to defend myself. As if my voice were in the process of being shut down. As if it were natural that, little by little, I would be replaced by a distorted version of myself, the confused old woman they invented. What hurt me most wasn't the doubt about my memory. It was the disrespect for my journey. They didn't remember the sleepless nights, the smiles I faked so as not to scare anyone when the bills didn't add up, the medicine I bought for them before I even bought food for myself. They didn't remember the times I knelt on the bathroom floor cleaning up sick children's vomit, the trips I skipped to pay for school, the jobs I took out of necessity, even with my knees screaming, just to keep everyone fed. This was the hidden truth. I had given my all, and now I was treated as if I had been a supporting character in their story. But they didn't see it. They were too busy laughing at my pauses, at my normal lapses. As if my age were a source of entertainment. As if the time I'd lived, instead of making me wiser, had made me disposable. And that's when I understood it wasn't just an attitude problem. It was a mindset issue. How old age is perceived, not just by them, but by a culture that insists on valuing only youth, speed, and practicality. What's slow hurts. What's deep bothers. What requires listening tires. And I was all of these things. My heart, which had always had room for forgiveness, began to create a new kind of defense. Not to retaliate, but to protect what dignity I still had left. I began writing things down. Not for fear of forgetting, but to prove I remembered. I had a notebook hidden in the bottom drawer of my dresser where I recorded what they did, what they said, the times, the details. Not to accuse, but to remind myself that I wasn't making it up. That this story was real. That I wasn't going crazy. And yet, even with everything recorded, with the words echoing in my head like an old, scratched tape, what struck me most was the laughter. The sound of mockery. Because it comes with a feeling of contempt that cuts deeper than any scream. Laughing at someone else's pain is a cruel way of ignoring their humanity. And that's exactly what they did to me. They dehumanized me in small, daily doses, while I still pretended it was just a phase. Until one day, in the middle of yet another one of these games, my grandson asked me to tell the story again about the day his mother fell off her bike. "Let's see if it matches yesterday's version, Grandma," he said, laughing. I looked at him, then at my daughter, then at my hidden notebook. And in that moment, something inside me became clearer than ever. They thought I was a game. That my memory was a board game. That my heart was a broken toy. But what they didn't know is that I still had a letter that no one expected. That night, the table was set with its usual care. Cutlery arranged, napkins folded, the smell of food filling the air with a familiarity that, until recently, warmed my chest. But there was something different hovering over the room. A tension disguised as routine. I could feel it in the way my daughter avoided my gaze, in the way my son-in-law spoke too loudly about inconsequential topics, and most of all, in the expectant silence that came from across the table, where my grandson sat with his cell phone on his lap, almost as if waiting for a show. And I knew exactly what the plot would be. They talked about everything. The news, the price of things, a new series. And when the words began to dwindle, someone, as always, brought up a memory. An event from the past. And, as always, they asked me to tell it. It was almost a ritual now, to see if Grandma remembered the story right. But that day, the trap was set more explicitly. My grandson didn't hide his tone or his sarcasm. He looked at me and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Grandma won't remember you told that before, will she? Tell it again, let's see if it fits." The silence that fell after that wasn't just mine. The entire room froze for a second. I felt all eyes turn to me as if waiting for my reaction. As if this were the climax of the game. The final round of a game I hadn't agreed to play. My fingers trembled on the napkin, and my heart beat slowly, heavily, like someone carrying more than they should. But I didn't lower my eyes. Not this time. I looked directly at him. I looked like a woman who has seen her entire life pass through the eyes of a child who now tested her as if she were an empty riddle. And then I said it. My voice was firm, without raising my voice, without showing anger. Just a cold certainty that had been in my throat for too long. I said, "I can forget dates, but I will never forget who made me feel ashamed of being old." The impact was immediate. Not because of the force of the words, but because no one expected it. It was as if that answer had come from a place they thought no longer existed within me. A place of lucidity, of living memory, of dignity. I saw my daughter lower her eyes. My son-in-law's fork stopped mid-sentence. And my grandson? He tried to smile. That awkward smile of someone who realizes, too late, that they've crossed a line. But it was too late. The sentence had been said, and it echoed through the room like a warning, like a mirror. It wasn't just an answer. It was enough. A turning point. I didn't need to scream, or bang on the table. I didn't need to cry. In that moment, what I said was enough to turn the tide. Because it wasn't just a statement. It was the revelation of something they pretended not to see. That I was present. That I saw. That I felt. That, behind the fake smiles and seemingly harmless jokes, there was a cruel process of dehumanization. And I was aware of it. The transformation that began in me at that moment wasn't blatant. It was silent, but definitive. Because that sentence, spoken in the middle of a common table, in the middle of a common night, was the turning point between the woman who silently accepted and the woman who decided, right then and there, to reclaim her voice. And the curious thing is that, even though it wasn't meant to hurt, that provocation from my grandson served as the spark I needed. Not for revenge, but to finally remember who I was. It's strange how a single sentence can be the turning point of an entire journey. Not because of its grandeur in itself, but because of what it represents behind the scenes of the soul. From that moment on, I realized I had more power than I imagined. And that perhaps the key wasn't to convince anyone, but to stand firm. Without shouting. Without asking permission. Just being there. Whole. With the marks life has given me and the memory that, yes, can fail, but still holds everything that truly matters. The table fell silent again. Conversation no longer flowed as before. Something had shifted in the air. An honest discomfort hung over everyone. And I, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel small. I felt whole. Because in that moment, everyone there understood that it wasn't about memory. It was about respect. It was about the impact of words. About how we treat those who raised us. And about how, sometimes, a truth spoken quietly has the power to shatter what has long been ignored. And it was with this feeling that I got up from the table. Not in protest, but as if closing a cycle. As if leaving the scene, leaving behind the certainty that there was still much to say. Because that was just the first sentence of a truth that still needed to be told. I returned to my room that night with my steps firmer than usual. Not out of arrogance, but out of a strange kind of relief you feel when, after a long time of swallowing, you finally blurt out a truth. I sat on the edge of my bed, still hearing the muffled sounds of dishes being washed and the hesitant voices in the living room. They didn't know what to say. And for the first time, that didn't bother me. I no longer needed their validation to remind me of who I am. As I removed my earrings and carefully folded my cardigan, I thought about how many women, how many mothers, grandmothers, aunts, have experienced something similar. How many have been silenced with forced smiles and belittled with affectionate nicknames that, in reality, hid contempt. How many have felt the pain of being treated as a righteous burden by those they carried in their arms. The truth is, this story isn't just mine. It's repeated in thousands of homes, at thousands of tables, every day. And perhaps you, listening now, have also experienced something like this. As a daughter, as a granddaughter, or even as a grandmother yourself. If anything in this story has upset you, leave a comment below about what bothered you most. Or what moved you. Your experience may resonate with someone else who may be silent, thinking they're the only one feeling this way. Sometimes, a shared phrase can reach more people than we imagine. And if you feel this conversation needs to continue, that stories like this deserve to be told, heard, reflected upon, then like this video. It seems like a small gesture, but it's how the platform understands this matters. That this message needs to reach more people. And if you felt part of this journey, if you recognized a little piece of your story here, if you found, between one sentence and another, a feeling you'd never been able to name, subscribe to the channel. Because this is where we'll continue talking about everything that's hidden in the corners of the house. In the silences no one notices. Behind the scenes of real life. Your presence here isn't just a number. It's strength. It's an embrace. It's continuity. And that night, as I turned off the lamp and pulled the covers up to my chin, I realized I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. But there were still things I needed to tell. Stories that, even old ones, needed to be heard. Because sometimes, it's precisely when we stop asking for space that our voice finds the right path to be heard. And it was at that precise point in my journey that something unexpected happened. The next morning, the house was eerily silent. It was as if something had been swept from the living room along with the crumbs from the previous dinner. The voices, which always carried through the rooms early in the morning, were muffled, restrained, as if afraid of bumping into broken pieces still scattered on the floor. But there were no visible pieces. Just a weight in the air. A kind of silence that doesn't disturb, but reveals. A silence that, for the first time, seemed respectful. And not of fear, nor of immediate guilt, but of awareness, of impact. What happened at that table wasn't just my response. It was an invisible turning point. A realignment in the way that house saw me. For the first time, I felt like I was being heard with human ears. That I wasn't the decorative grandmother, nor the caricature of a failing memory. I was the woman who survived the loss of her husband, the grief that squeezes the soul in silence. The woman who underwent 3 surgeries without saying a word so as not to worry anyone. Who held her family on her shoulders when everything threatened to collapse. The woman who now spoke with a clear, unshaken voice, but charged with truths that had never been spoken. My daughter was the first to seek me out. She came slowly, like someone treading on sacred ground. She sat beside me on the couch, saying nothing at first. And I let time speak. Sometimes, it's in silence that the truth reveals itself. Until she took a deep breath and said to me, "Mom, I never meant to hurt you. But I realize now that what we thought was lightheartedness was just a lack of listening." It was the first time in years I'd heard my daughter admit something like that. And it wasn't a formal apology, but it went deeper. It was a breach. A crack in the mentality that sustained that cycle. And there, in that crack, light entered. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, didn't speak to me that day. She left early with the children, looking away, visibly embarrassed. But she didn't mock me either. She didn't repeat jokes. And that, for me, was enough. Sometimes change doesn't come with pretty words, but with the end of cruel ones. And my grandson. Oh, my grandson. He couldn't look me in the eye until the end of the week. He avoided passing me in the hallways, walked slower, more thoughtfully. And when he passed me, his face no longer wore that sarcastic smile. It was a different look. One that still carried resistance, but also doubt. And when someone begins to doubt their own behavior, there's a chance for transformation. But the most curious thing was what happened to me. Because that day, I also saw myself differently. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt whole. Not because of the strength of my response, but because I realized there was still truth alive within me. That even though I was discredited, erased, and devalued, my story still had the power to spark movement. And perhaps, more than any revenge or confrontation, what we truly want is this: for our presence to have an impact. For our pain to teach. For our silence not to be mistaken for weakness, but for patience. There was something almost divine in that feeling. Not in a religious sense, but as a kind of cosmic justice. As if everything sown in years of silent surrender had finally germinated in the form of consciousness. Because when life decides to teach through pain, it does so with precision. And every word spoken that night returned like a mirror to those who spoke them, thinking there would be no consequences. The law of return doesn't knock loudly. It whispers. It shows. It transforms. But it wasn't easy to maintain that calm afterward. Because what comes after catharsis is emptiness. And emptiness is frightening. It makes you want to go back, to suppress what was said, to pretend nothing happened. Because change requires continuity, not just moments of impact. And that's when I realized the next decision needed to be mine. I couldn't wait for their transformation to determine what my journey would be like from then on. Because the most dangerous thing would be to settle into the relief of having been heard and forget that, even so, there was still so much to say. So much to live. So much to adjust to. And that same day, as I rummaged through my notebook, the one where I recorded everything, I realized something even greater. What brought me there wasn't just the accumulation of hurt, but the silence I'd maintained for fear of losing the little affection I had left. I'd accepted what little I had for fear of having nothing. But now, with this new space that had opened up, I needed to choose more consciously what would occupy my days. What would fill my next pages. Because there, between what had been and what was yet to come, lay a new chance to rewrite the backstory of my own story. And I was no longer willing to waste that chance. The changes didn't happen suddenly. Nor did they come like scenes in a movie where everything is resolved with a hug and an apology. They came gradually, like a light rain soaking the ground without us even realizing it. In the first few days after that night, the atmosphere at home was still strange, as if everyone was walking on eggshells. But there was something different in the way they looked at me. It was no longer that impatient look, like someone who wants me to shut up or make a mistake so they can become the butt of jokes. It was a more attentive look. More present. At first, I confess I was skeptical. I thought it was just a reflection of guilt, a fleeting attempt to compensate for the discomfort. But then small gestures began to happen. Details that only those who have been ignored can notice. Melissa, my daughter, began including me in conversations. Not as if explaining something to a child, but as if sharing something with someone important. One day, while we were washing the dishes together, she asked my opinion on a problem she was facing with her husband. Something she would previously have shared with a friend, or not at all. And I listened, my heart heavy and grateful at the same time. It was just a conversation, but it was also a silent request for reconnection. Brian, my grandson, the same one who so often tested me, appeared in my room with a notebook and a somewhat awkward look. "Grandma, can you help me with a history paper?" It wasn't just a request for schoolwork. It was an opening. A breach of trust. And when I sat next to him to explain World War II, a topic that has always moved me deeply, I realized he listened to me with genuine attention. That he asked questions. That he took notes. That he wanted to learn. And, more than that, he wanted to learn from me. It was as if, suddenly, my voice had regained its value. And Cheryl? Well, Cheryl was never one for making big statements. But one morning, while I was watering the plants in the backyard, she arrived with a cup of tea and said, "Here, second moms deserve a little affection too." I smiled, saying nothing. But inside, something in me reorganized. It was as if those words had mended an old tear, the kind you didn't even know still hurt. Because being called a second mom, by someone who always looked at me from a distance, was more than a loving gesture. It was an acknowledgement. A confirmation that, even without direct blood ties, the affection you build can overcome the hurt. And me. I was reborn. Not in the poetic way books like to describe. It was a silent, internal rebirth, made of micro-transformations. I started looking at myself in the mirror with less harshness. I started leaving the house more. I started writing more often again. I started saying no when I needed to rest. I gradually reclaimed what made me feel alive before I was just the grandmother of the house. I started walking in the morning again, not just as a health habit, but as a ritual of reconnecting with myself. With each step, I felt like I was reclaiming territory. A territory that, for too long, I'd let others occupy with their pressures, their expectations, and their cruel words. And perhaps for the first time, I realized that respect isn't something we ask for. It's something we impose with presence, with positioning, with boundaries. Not with shouting or confrontation, but with truth. My journey taught me this. That dignity has nothing to do with age, nor with perfect memory. It has to do with how you present yourself in the world, and how you react when they try to erase your history. There were still wounds, of course. Not everything heals with behavioral changes. Some words still echo. Some memories still weigh heavily. But now I had the tools to deal with it. I had a voice. I had courage. I had regained my sense of worth. And with that, I also gained something I'd long lost. The right to choose how I wanted to be treated. Because the truth is, when we begin to respect ourselves, the world learns to see us differently. And little by little, those who once belittled us begin to listen more attentively. Not because they've completely changed, but because they've realized that, within the silent woman who's always been there, there's a strength that should never have been underestimated. And it was with this new perspective on myself and on everything I'd experienced, that I decided something that would change the course of that house forever. A decision that involved neither revenge nor retribution, but carried within it a truth so profound that no one could ignore it. It took me months to understand that forgiveness, when it comes without truth, doesn't heal. It only postpones. It postpones pain, it postpones conflict, it postpones liberation. And as much had changed since that dinner, as much as gestures had become kinder, words more careful, and routines more respectful, there was still an unresolved need inside me. Something that wasn't about what they were doing today, but about what they never understood what they did yesterday. It was as if the respect I was receiving now, though genuine, had been built on the oblivion of the past. As if just being treated with kindness today was enough to erase all the times I'd been tested, devalued, and diminished. And it wasn't revenge I wanted. It was awareness. Because without it, everything could have happened again with another woman, another grandmother, another story. And that's when I realized something still needed to be revealed. Then one day, on a random late afternoon, I found myself with my cell phone in my hands. I felt that slight pang of creative provocation that only those who have been underestimated understand. I put the device in the china cabinet drawer, way back, behind the linen napkins no one else used. And I returned to the living room as if nothing had happened. The television was on, my grandson on the couch, the smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen. Everything so everyday, so peaceful. And yet, I was waiting for something I wasn't even sure would happen. A few hours later, Brian began searching for his phone. First calmly. Then, a little more agitated. He turned over the cushions, looked under the table, rummaged through his backpacks. And finally, with a look of frustration and embarrassment on his face, he came to me. "Grandma, have you seen my phone anywhere?" he asked. And I, sitting in the armchair, knitting in hand and calm in my heart, looked up and replied, "Don't you remember where you put it, my son? Is your memory failing you?" The silence that followed was delicious. He stood still for 2 seconds. 2 seconds that felt like an eternity. And then, he laughed. But it wasn't the laugh I'd feared. It wasn't the kind of laugh that hurts, that mocks, that dehumanizes. It was a laugh with a certain sparkle in its eyes. Like someone who understands. Like someone who finally sees themselves on the other side of the story. And in that smile, I saw something I'd longed for, respect. It was there, in that small, seemingly banal gesture, that I realized the cycle had closed. Not with pain, nor with sorrow, but with awareness. With a touch of poetic justice that life, from time to time, allows us to experience. The sweet irony of seeing the tables turned, but without having to play dirty. Simply showing, with lightness, what had made me feel so heavy. And the most beautiful thing of all is that I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to demand, point, or demand. I simply reflected their behavior with a clean mirror, where they could see themselves, perhaps for the first time. And, in that reflection, find something they didn't even know they needed, empathy. This experience taught me much more about mentality than about memory. Because what was at stake wasn't whether I remembered everything, but whether they would be able to remember who I am. And me. I never forgot. Not the dates, nor the names, nor the details of the stories I've told so many times. But I also never forgot the look on everyone's face when they laughed at me. And now, I won't forget the look of respect with which they listened to me. That's when I understood that true transformation doesn't happen when others change. But when we stop accepting what we don't deserve. When we stop expecting understanding and start taking a stand with truth. When we stop trying to prove who we are and simply show it, with small, consistent actions, and a courage that comes from deep within. But there was still one last thing missing. A gesture. A decision that would end this cycle not only for me, but for everyone there. Something that wouldn't carry bitterness, but that would make it clear that, even with forgiveness, I hadn't forgotten what I'd experienced. And it was with this intention that one night, I sat alone on the porch, staring at the streetlights, and wrote a letter. Not to confront, but to reveal something no one expected. That night, while the house slept, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and my favorite pen. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I was breathing slowly, my heart light but steady. Because, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't writing to justify myself. I was writing to leave a mark. A revelation. Something that would close that chapter with the same dignity with which I began my life. With truth. The words emerged slowly, as if they had been inside me for years, waiting for the right moment to become a voice. I wrote about the days I felt invisible in that house. About the times I was treated like a test, like a joke, like a faded memory. But I also wrote about the gestures that came after. The softer glances, the genuine care, the respect that slowly began to blossom. And most of all, the silent transformation that took place within me. Because in the end, what impacted me most on this journey wasn't their mistakes, but the decisions I had to make to avoid getting lost in it all. I folded the letter lovingly and placed it on the table, next to an old photo. I, younger, holding Melissa as a baby, my eyes full of hope and my face marked by the time yet to come. At the bottom, a simple note: don't forget the one who held you when the world seemed too big. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a reminder. An invitation to remember. To be mindful. To the respect that is so often forgotten in the rush of everyday life. The next morning, the house awoke with more lightness. They found the letter and read it in silence. No one called me to ask why. No one argued. But the hugs that day were longer. The words, sweeter. Melissa looked at me as if she finally understood something no apology could express. And when Brian said goodbye to go to school, he rested his forehead against mine and said softly, "Thank you, Grandma." 2 words, but so full of meaning that they almost broke me inside. And that's why I sit here today to tell you all this. Not because I want recognition, nor because I need to prove anything, but because I know there are thousands of women like me. Women who grew old in a home that stopped listening to them. Women who saw their stories treated as exaggeration, their memories as noise, their emotions as drama. And if I can make even one of these women feel less alone today, then every line of this letter was worth it. Being old isn't being weak. It's having lived long enough to understand the value of silence, patience, and listening. It's carrying on your body the scars of all the times we held on, even when everything inside us wanted to collapse. It's having accumulated wisdom not from books, but from pain bravely endured. And more than that, it's having the right, the sacred right, to continue being heard. Because a story doesn't lose value with time. It grows stronger. So if you have a grandmother, or a mother, or any older woman close to you, listen. Listen with an open heart. Because one day, you'll beg to remember what she said. You'll wish you'd paid more attention. You'll understand that what seemed like repetition was actually a subtle plea: don't erase me. And maybe by that day, it will already be too late. But there's still time. Time to change. Time to acknowledge. Time to heal. And if, at any point in this story, you too felt invisible, whether as a daughter, a mother, or a grandmother, leave a "I'm with you until the end" message in the comments. Because your voice matters. Your experience matters. And when you comment, you help keep this space alive. A space where real stories like this can continue to be told. If this story touched you in any way, please like this video. This helps YouTube deliver it to more people who, like us, need to hear that they're not alone. And if you believe more people need to learn to listen before they mock, please share it. Send this video to someone who may not yet understand the weight of the words it says. And if you want to keep hearing these truths, these stories, these behind-the-scenes details that are rarely revealed, subscribe to the channel. This is where we transform pain into awareness, silence into voice, and the past into power. Because sometimes, all a woman needs is space to remind the world of who she is. And I still have more to tell. If you've stuck with me this far, it's because something in this story truly spoke to you. And that, to me, is worth everything. Because when we connect like this, heart to heart, It's not just about watching a video. It's about recognizing yourself, reflecting, and maybe even healing a little piece that was forgotten. So, if this message found a place in there, leave a comment below. This message was for me. I read each one with care, and that's how we keep this conversation alive, true, and full of purpose. Subscribe to the channel if you feel this type of content is valuable to your journey. Here we talk about things that aren't often said, but that need to be said. And when you subscribe, you help this voice reach those who need to hear it most. Oh, and leave a like. Not because I asked, but because you felt it was worth being here until the end. This shows me we're on the right track and gives me the strength to keep sharing more. Now, if this story touched you, there's a video right here that continues along the same lines. Click and join me for another conversation that might move you in an unexpected way. I'll see you there.